Story Time with Stephanie
Hi,
Story.
I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show, Story Time, where I get to talk to other writers about their passions and processes. I'm very honored to have my guest here today because he has this long storied career in publishing as an English professor and as an award-winning writer of like 20 books and hundreds of essays. And he was also a publisher at his own publishing house. So he knows this industry backwards and forwards and the whole writing thing. He is out now in his 80s, and he is out with a beautiful new memoir called Fire in the Straw: Notes on Inventing a Life. Welcome to the show, Nick Lyons.
I am delighted to be here, Stephanie. I've heard a lot about you. Lily has told me such good things. We have an editor in common, and I am delighted to talk about this book, which I've waited a long time to write. I think I wrote the first chapter of it in a sort of primitive form about 60 years ago and put it away and forgot about it. I never published it. And then about 2 years ago, took up this whole process again and feel very excited to have it done and off my brain. It doesn't nibble at my brain anymore. It's out.
That's so well. First of all, you should be proud of it. It is a beautiful book. For those of you at home, it reads a bit like a series of essays that weave together into this big tapestry of a life. So you get like it took you 60 years to write. It also spans a huge swath of your life, all the way from childhood, being adopted, and all of those stories, all the way until as of late. So you wrote the first story 60 years ago. What was there something that made you go back and think now is the moment when I finally want to revisit this and go back to it?
It's interesting. I think it was two deaths. The death of my wife of 58 years from cancer. And then a year later, the death of my oldest son from melanoma, skin cancer. They just shook me completely. And I began to think back about our life together. I didn't want to write about that. I didn't want to write about the extraordinary pain of their deaths. But I did find that I was trying to find the pattern, the arc of my life, really for the first time when I started about 2 years ago when I was 86. I didn't know whether I'd ever finish it, but they are separate essays in a sense. Some of them have been published separately, some of the sections over the years. All of them have been changed to fit into the book. But I think it was somehow drawn out of me by the two deaths, the desire to have something tangible that I could record of the life I'd lived and a little bit about them both. But I tried to account for my life somehow. I had somehow had a misbegotten childhood that was filled with basketball and fishing and everything I could do not to read. I did reasonably well in math, of all things, and as a result got into the Wharton School of Finance and Commerce, though I hated it, and stayed only because I played basketball for Penn. I barely graduated from Penn successfully. I went into the Army. While I was in the Army, I picked up a copy of the Portable Hemingway. I don't think I'd ever read a book because I wanted to, only those things that were assigned. And usually I felt rather poorly about the reading, rather unpleasantly troubled by the reading. But I read that and it seemed it's about, the story I read was Big Two-Hearted River, which is about fishing, which I happen to know a good deal about. And I felt, my goodness, is this literature? Is this really serious writing about this thing, this trout fishing that I've loved all my life? And that sort of like a little bit of sand in the oyster that makes it start building a pearl. I began to grow from this to a passionate interest in reading. And I read everything I could get my hands on without any discretion at all. I was reading Mickey Spillane, Auntie Mame, Steinbeck, Kafka, all at the same time in some big unholy stew. But that's much of what I did for the 2 years I was in the army. I read very, very deeply and loved it and felt that it was going to go someplace, but I didn't know where.
Okay, I already have like 8,000 questions from that one answer. But I do have to ask, so because when I was reading, like early in your book, before you mentioned Hemingway, I thought, I wonder if you were a fan of Hemingway, because it is sort of fishing and it's very crisp, clean prose and so it sort of reminded me that, do you think that that initial love of Hemingway stayed with you for life? And do you think that's common for writers that they pick up somebody early in their inspirational life and sort of carry that with them throughout their lives?
He's very hard not to imitate. And in my case, uh, I perhaps began with that desire for the writing to be crisp and for it to be meaningful. Uh, but I never became the understated Hemingway that I love so much, the early Hemingway,
Mhm.
which I love much better than the later books. And I think there are a few places in this book where I speak about what I was after, and it's not what Hemingway was after. Hemingway was very much interested in cutting things to the bone and being as spare as possible and suggesting as much as he could. Story like Hills Like White Elephants is brilliant in what he leaves out.
Yes.
It's just a very powerful piece. But in my case, I think partly from the fishing, partly from the basketball, I wanted to get a prose. I kept hearing the phrase "find your voice," and in those early years when I was struggling, I kept trying to think of what would my voice possibly be. Well, it would include the mud of a trout stream and the swiftness of the water, and the quickness of a basketball game.
Can you tell us in your words why you use the title Fire in the Straw?
It's an old phrase that I found, actually a 15th century manuscript by a man named Thomas Lodge. Nobody else has read. And it goes something like, the tiger cannot hide his claws, nor the lion, and the lion's looks are not the maps of his meaning. Fire cannot be hidden in the straw, but at last it will have its course. And I think it's the fact that fire can't be hidden in the straw that I felt my head was very much like straw. And this fire, a passion, was something that was beginning to flame forth, and I had to know what to do with it. It was very passionate, really like a flame, and took me a devil of a time to find out what I was best at and how to do it. And
But you get so caught, like I got so caught up in reading your work with your love and your passion for literature. Like it just drips off the page how much you're invested in the writing. And like there was this one quote you were talking about that your main sort of gift in life as an educator particularly was expressing this love of literature to your students. You talk about this some in the memoir, but where does your, I mean, you have an extraordinary passion for literature. Like and I understand it because I have an extraordinary passion for art history. Like I'm a geek. I'm a total nerd in art history. Um so I can relate, but do you know really where yours comes from? That deep passion?
I think that I was hungry for something
Mhm.
important to me, and I could not find it in religion. This is not a substitute for religion, but I just didn't find the answers to the questions that I had on my brain: how to live, how to say something, how to communicate. Um, they were more elementary than the issues that religion usually takes up, and I think that I found glimpses of that in such different writers as Jane Austen and Kafka and Dostoevsky and Shakespeare and Yeats and all of these people. As I read them with great hunger, and found that for the first time in my life, someone wanted to hear what I said in a classroom. And when I began to teach in graduate school, I fell in love with teaching. And I had always disliked my teachers, disliked the classroom, had felt that it was a waste of time. I'd rather be out fishing or playing basketball. But when I began to teach, I felt all of these people, all of these characters were rolling around in my head, and I wanted to share them so that the enthusiasm I had, I felt very strongly I wanted to share when I taught it, and I wanted more of it.
You're talking about getting connected. Like it sounds like connection. Like you found connection to other people through reading and through teaching it to other. Like you finally found, so you said people wanted to hear what I had to say, and that's amazing. Did it have something to do with seeking connection to other people?
I think that's absolutely right, Stephanie. It's a connection through the world of literature to the people in the books. First of all, uh, they are as real to me or have been in the past as people I knew, cousins of mine and relatives. Um, they and they had such interesting lives that I very much wanted to enter into those lives. I wasn't going to live the way a character in Dostoevsky lived, but I could live through it. I could feel a lot of the things that they felt. It woke my feelings up. It woke my brain up, and it gave me connections not only to the world of literature, but I think to the world, because literature, if it's any good, is connected to the world. And what I found in the books was a way to read what was happening around me. The cunning of a politician is nothing to the cunning of a Machiavelli. You already hear it in Iago, in Othello. You hear these people, and it teaches you something that connects you to something in life that is absolutely necessary for an adult to be in touch with. And it was fascinating. I just couldn't get enough of it. I carried books around me. In the army, they have field jacket with two big pockets at the top, and paperbacks fit right in them. And I always had them there. But
Like post World War II, you're walking around. We were in France, right? And you're walking around with paperbacks everywhere. That's awesome.
but I think that having discovered this fire, so to speak, that I wanted to follow, that I wanted to pursue, um, what scared me most at that hinge period was that I had no skill for it. It took me several very, very scary years in which I made the most ludicrous mistakes in my readings of literature. I couldn't write worth a damn. I wrote a lot of things and showed them to a lot of people, and it all came back. Um, I had no capacity to put onto paper the even the stories. The stories came out mawkish and silly, and it took a while. Mary, my wife, whose painting you saw on the wall here, had been a painter from the age of 5. She had won an award in Oakland, California, the Miss Elsie contest for the local Oakland Tribune. And she had studied with Max Beckmann when she was 15, and been to Paris on a as a teenager through the high school that she went to, and was absolutely devoted. I've never met anyone more devoted than Mary was to painting. It was her whole life. Even when we had 4 children, she painted all the time, every day. But through her, I understood what it was to be that close to an art, that close to something that you were making, how much of a commitment it meant, that it meant everything. And there was also love and affection and fun and a lot of other things. But you had to have at that center a devotion to what you were doing. She had it. I think I found it.
Well, I started to say you just described two very different ways of going out about making art, right? Like in the middle of your memoir, there are these lovely passages of early struggle, and I loved reading those because I think every writer and artist goes through like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I'm a disaster, and you were so forthright about it that it was really beautiful. Whereas your wife was this like prodigy almost. Is there a better way to do it? Is one better than the, like, being talented and just being able to do it, or does it all take hard work? Where do you fall on that? Is great art, I guess, made from really hard struggle and work, or is it made from talent, or is it made from both? I don't know.
All of the above, Stephanie. You're a writer, you know. It comes from every place, any place you can get it. And what Mary did, I know very few painters who have had that particular pattern. The fact that she is not one of the major painters for all of this is something that I think troubled her. Her ambition, she was a very shy woman, and her ambition was to be one of the serious painters, to be one of the part of the discussion, is the way she would put it, part of the talk. She had a few critics, like the great critic Jed Pearl, who wrote frequently about her in the New Republic and other places, and some others. And her work is in a dozen museums now and colleges. Bard College, Mills College have some of her large paintings. But I think that's, that's something that fell to her, possibly the result of having a bad time at home. So she went to art. She put her life in art. In my case, I came to it quite late. It was a tremendous change when I finally changed from being, and I was very thin then, Stephanie, and I put on about 60 pounds when I started living only in my head and not on the basketball court anymore.
You said something at the very beginning of this conversation that I had been thinking about. And you sort of talk about it in your prologue as well, that part of memoir is creating, it's almost fabricating what you're doing. You're turning yourself into a character. You're turning your life into a narrative. And you said at the beginning of this conversation that you sort of wanted to find the arc of your life. What did you find by putting all of these essays together and really being, because you're a little older than I am. You have a little bit longer of a view on your own life and on this world and what it means. What did you find out in your 80s looking back at your life about that arc?
Well, I think the question of any autobiography being a fabrication is something that my friend Herbert Leibowitz has in his book, Fabricating Lives, which is about 10 prominent autobiographies that really are twisting things. I think it's inevitable that you have to twist it. You take a life that is 80 more years and relatively each day rather packed with details, and it would bore anybody to death to hear about that. My decision to do it virtually as a series of essay-like sections was to have enough dots so that one could see the arc of a life and let it and not try to do it every detail. Hundreds and hundreds of details I have written about elsewhere or would like to write about are not in that book, but it is the arc that interested me, not all the details, but just, and not even the only most important ones. Some of the ones that I had were wonderful, with children of mine or with my wife, or any one of a number of events that took place. I think that it's very, very hard for most people to write an autobiography where people will be interested in the narrative from beginning to end. In most cases, it's overwritten, there's too much of it. And as an editor, I saw a great number of those in which somebody would write a 600-page autobiography, and one would say, well, 100 pages of this is terrific, and another 50 maybe, but it's not that's too much. One of the things that kept going on in my life, when I found this fire, I also had 4 children. I was living in a city with a painter who wasn't selling, and no money behind me. I inherited no money. question becomes, how do you survive? What do you do? And in my case, since I always had a little extra energy, I decided to accrete or find new jobs to do on top of my full-time teaching. And there was a time when I was teaching full-time at Hunter College. I had myself shifted into the night session so that I could work someplace during the day, and started in what was another new field, publishing. I went in as a proofreader. They thought with a PhD, I ought to be smart enough to learn something. But I found it fascinating. How do you edit someone else's book? You don't want it to become your book. You have to learn a whole bunch of skills. You have to read slowly, carefully. You have to learn to keep someone else's voice, but to protect them from making a fool of themselves. And I got to be executive editor in about 10 or 11 years. So I was teaching full time. I was being an executive editor at a big publishing house. The dean at Hunter College said I couldn't do it anymore. So I decided to take someone's offer to run a small house that was a subsidiary for an English firm. Scared me out of my wits. I didn't know how to run a business. I'd fled from business. At the same time, I was offered some ghostwriting, which took place after I taught at night. And I'd write these books. I wrote 4 of them in about 5.5 weeks each, full-length books with other people's names on them. It's not something I would have chosen to do, but they were good books. One was a bestseller. My children remember the typewriter going when they went to bed and the typewriter going in the morning. But I did that. And then when I finally retired from both, I began to write at the 10, 12 hours a day. So I really had 3 or 4 professions mixed in with all of that. That's protecting the flame. That's not finding the flame anymore. It's protecting it.
I love the idea of you had all those jobs, you did all those different things to protect the flame of your passion, because so many other fellow writers, when I'm out talking, they get so frustrated that they have to have a day job or they have to do other things in order to be published, in order to put books out. People get so angsty and just sort of angry about it, instead of thinking of it as a way to protect your own passion and to keep you on the road, right? I mean, isn't that part of life?
That's exactly right. It did keep me on the road. It also did one other thing. Being an editor taught me things about writing. It's not an alien activity. And ghostwriting, which I had no sense that I could do, I produced a narrative of someone's life. In the 3 cases, I did 2 others as well. There were 5 altogether. They taught me something about writing fast or writing hard or writing commercially. And even though I tried to stay away from some of those things, I learned an awful lot about them, about writing, by doing those. I never had the feeling that I was giving up and sacrificing that great thing that I loved so much. I always felt somehow I'm going to make this other thing that I'm doing feed into the thing I wanted to do most. I think that if I could say one thing is, when I lived in that little room in Greenwich Village by myself, and I didn't know whether I could write, and I was trying to read and didn't understand, forgot what I read every night. What I was looking for was a life. I didn't have a life when I was in that little room. And what I found was a full life. And as I look back on it now, I look at all these things I did. I said, my goodness, wasn't that a lot of fun? I don't look at it as having impinged on me, but as having given me a life. And I've been thrilled to have had one.
Oh, that's such a beautiful thing. That is such a beautiful thought, particularly when you are putting together a memoir, right? When you're trying to look back over this life and you seem so appreciative of the life you've had. And that is and it comes through in the book that
Yeah.
even the difficult times, you seem to embrace life in a really beautiful way. Speaking of something you embrace, which I have to ask about, I've already kept you too long. I don't care. I love listening to you. Um, Fly fishing. You are obsessed with the water. You talk about the water a lot in this book, and you have spent a lot of your life writing about fishing, fly fishing. What is it about fly fishing? Speaking of passions and things people get swept up in, why has fishing been such your avenue for just getting escapism? It felt like you were an escape.
When I was at the boarding school, I first fished. I was about 5.5, 6 years old. And I used to fish with a stick and a little bent pin and a worm. You have the little bobber on the top of the water that indicates when the fish is biting the line down below. There was something about the electricity of that, of the movement of the bobber on the water, and then to look into the water, and it's opaque. You don't know what's down there. There's a mystery to it. And I think as I graduated to different kinds of fishing, fly fishing satisfied me most because you're closer to nature than almost anybody, even a trained naturalist. You're looking at the water, you're watching the currents, you have to understand the currents, you have to understand where the trout would be feeding, what his habits are. You have to know something about the insects that the trout is eating. And trout are most interesting because they eat these tiny insects. And there are a whole bunch of them on rivers, 40, 50 different kinds of fly. And you have flies that you hope will imitate the food that he's feeding on. So it's a whole process of involvement with this. And people hear that I like fishing. They say you must be very patient. It was never anything. Patience had nothing to do with it. It's really having a keen interest in what's going on out there and how you're going to find a way, to use the word you used before, connecting to this activity down in this mysterious area of the water. I loved it. I absolutely, had to give it up, but I absolutely loved doing it.
The way you just described fishing made me want to go. I'm not a fisher. And I'm like, no, that sounds great. Like you have to be curious and you have to go figure things out and you've got to go like that sounds like my kind of thing. I've never thought that before. Thank you so much for joining me. And everybody at home will buy your book. I put up pretty stills of it so everybody will get Fire in the Straw because it is really a lovely, lovely read. There's so much heart in it. I loved it. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for spending all this time with me. I appreciate it. And see everybody else next time. Bye-bye.
Story time with Stephanie. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie. Story.